Issues concerning the private sphere, to do with the home, the family, the body, love, sex, and reproduction, are an integral part of feminist theory and have been historically driving forces for concrete political action. Private issues are never really private. They are always affected and shaped by a range of social, medical, and academic practices. This is part of what is meant by the feminist claim that the personal is political. Another part of what is meant is that the personal is politically important in its own right. Feminists may all have something to say about the importance of the private or personal, but they do not all say the same thing. They disagree about the significance of particular practices and phenomena such as marriage, heterosexuality, motherhood, abortion, women's education, and so on. And they disagree about what it means to say that the personal is politically significant. To illustrate some of this variety of positions, in this lecture I'll be focusing on what feminists have had to say about marriage, combining both historical and contemporary perspectives. Let's start from a pretty standard narrative. According to the standard narrative, historically, the institutions of marriage and the family have meant oppression and exploitation for the women that they have included, along with an additional stigmatization and other penalties for those excluded. This being a function of the unjust and unequal laws that surrounded and partially constituted the institution of marriage. At least on the legal side, things are now very different. Even gay marriage is being legalized in some countries. We also now have new birth control technologies such as the pill. And progressive liberal laws have made both contraception and abortion safely available to more women. Where we still have some way to go is in the sphere of culture and attitudes. For example, to end the second shift by getting men to do their fair share of the housework, childcare, and so on. And some more legislation may also be needed, especially with regards to parental leave, so that women can finally be on a level playing field with men when it comes to competing for careers. There are several problems with the standard historical narrative. One, there is no constant item or institution which can be charted or compared across different social and historical contexts. So when marriage is criticized, one might be talking about a state institution, about a civil or religious one, about monogamous or polygamous marriage. Then the narrative fails to cover certain basic points of historical fact. For example, the fact that women in early Muslim societies had independent property rights, or that medieval Islamic societies also permitted easy divorce and remarriage, contraception, and usually abortion. Finally, the standard narrative paints a picture of how our understanding of and attitudes toward marriage and family follows a smooth but steady progression, culminating in a relative positivity about the present, which doesn't always reflect the reality. Feminist critiques of marriage are very diverse, but they can be grouped into reformist and revolutionary ones, depending on their answers to two questions. One, should one attempt to reform marriage so that it is no longer a patriarchal institution, or should one fight to abolish it because it is an inherently patriarchal institution? And two, can the abolition of marriage be thought of as an isolated aim so that we might target marriage directly, aiming to abolish it, even while holding the rest of social reality basically fixed? Or is it to be thought of only as part of a wider project of social transformation? But what is the problem with marriage? For an easier navigation of the feminist critiques of marriage, I suggest to start from the question of what makes marriage special in comparison with other types of relationships. This should help us understand why there was and continues to be so much fuss about it. Marriage is not singled out by commitment or permanence or children or love, as these things are present in other types of relationships as well. It is also not distinguished by religion. Some marriages are religious, but many aren't. The key distinction between marriage and unmarried partnership is the role of the state. Marriage is a form of relationship recognized and regulated by the state. When the state recognizes marriage, it does three things. It defines, it endorses, and it regulates. What does that mean? State-recognized marriage means that the state defines marriage and controls access to it. In a marriage regime, the state dictates who may marry. In doing this, the state will also make rather complex and controversial statements about value and meaning, statements that promote some ways of life and family forms and demote others. Also, when the state recognizes marriage, it provides public and official endorsement of the state of being married, and thus it makes marriage special among other types of relationships. And state-recognized marriage involves giving married people a bundle of rights and duties concerning many areas of life, including financial support, parental responsibility, inheritance, taxation, migration, and next of kinship. These are crucial areas of life that affect everyone, both married and unmarried. Each of these three aspects of marriage state recognition have been historically used in ways that instigate and perpetuate a variety of hierarchies, most consistently based on gender, but also on race, religion, sexuality, and class. So it's not surprising that feminists have been objecting to marriage for centuries. In 1869, John Stuart Mill, in The Subjection of Women, described the legal institution of marriage as the primitive state of slavery lasting on. For the anarchist Emma Goldman, writing in 1910, marriage was an insurance policy that a woman pays for with her name, her privacy, her self-respect, her very life, one that condemns her to lifelong dependency, to parasitism, to complete uselessness, individual as well as social. In The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan wrote about marriage as the cause of the problem that has no name, the stultifying dependence of the white middle-class American housewife. Shulamith Firestone declared in Dialectic of Sex in 1970 that love, perhaps even more than childbearing, is the pivot of women's oppression today. And finally, in Sexual Politics, Kate Millett concluded, patriarchy's chief institution is the family. Summarizing feminist critiques of marriage is a daunting task and one that I have no hope or ambition of doing now, but I still like to mention a couple of highlights. What feminists didn't like and criticized about marriage? 1. There was the economic and legal significance of marriage for women. In particular, concerns over property, custody, and separation rights, as well as the lack of legal recognition of domestic violence. Then, feminists also debated and took action over the exclusion from the marriage institution of same-sex couples. Many gay and lesbian activists have campaigned to be allowed to marry on equal terms with heterosexual couples. They argue that this is a requirement of equality and that it could have positive, diversifying, and liberating effects on the character and social significance of marriage. Other feminists have criticized this approach as assimilationist, too uncritical of the institution of marriage, and too willing to model same-sex relationships on a heterosexual marital ideal. They have argued that same-sex marriage would extend the undesirable effects of heterosexual marriage to gay relationships, for example, by producing economic incentives to stay in bad relationships and making it more difficult for people to escape domestic violence and abuse. Other feminist critiques have focused on the role of sex and the use of a woman's body in marriage. So many feminists, for instance, be them liberal, socialist, and radical, have drawn a link between marriage and prostitution in virtue of the fact that in some marriage types, women are viewed and treated as property, or as exchanging their sexuality and reproductive resources for the economic protection of their spouses. Feminists have also attacked sentimentalized notions of motherhood and what they have seen as the treatment of women's bodies within the traditional families as machines for the production of babies. They also, in general, have been at the forefront of pro-choice activism, arguing that access to contraception and abortion is necessary if women are to have control of their own bodies and lives. Also, early critiques highlighted the so-called existential aspect of women's oppression in the private sphere. This refers to the fact that the burden of a woman in the modern family setup is not only having to do all or most of the work associated with childcare, but also with the deprivation of other kinds of experience and contact. Most people cannot take their child to work, and many social engagements are such that children are excluded. Therefore, women will be excluded from these social engagements. In addition to putting into question the near compulsory status of a certain kind of motherhood, lesbian feminists have also identified the phenomenon of compulsory heterosexuality. This phrase has been made popular by Adrienne Rich in her 1980 essay Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. Rich argued that heterosexuality is neither innate in human beings, nor is it the only normal sexuality. She proposed instead that sexuality is on a lesbian continuum. Until women can have non-sexual relationships with other women and sexual relationships without the imposition of cultural judgment, women couldn't really have power, and thus feminism could not achieve its goals. Rich claimed that men's access to women is protected by compulsory heterosexuality, which in turn is enforced by culture. How? Rich sees the arts and popular culture, television, films, and advertising as powerful media to reinforce heterosexuality as the only normal behavior. Compulsory heterosexuality was also criticized for being pervasive even within the feminist movement in the 70s and 80s, dominating both feminist scholarship and feminist activism. Lesbian lives were for a long time invisible in history and in other serious studies, and lesbians were not welcome and seen as the exception and therefore a danger to the acceptance of the feminist movement. The feminist critiques just listed have particular force in times and places where women are legally subordinated in marriage. But many states, though by no means all, have reformed their marriage laws so that they are gender equal. Is it possible to have an egalitarian marriage regime, one in which wives are not legally inferior to husbands? So, feminist critiques of marriage might seem anachronistic, or so the standard historical narrative goes. But marriage remains an institution in which women tend to be economically dependent on men, partly because, under current social conditions, women's role as primary carers for children leaves them at a disadvantage in terms of pursuing a career. Moreover, women are still at greater risk of poverty than men in the event of a divorce. And finally, an equal division of household labor is still very unusual, even among couples whose professed attitudes to gender and marriage can be classified as egalitarian. So, removing misogyny from law is not the same as removing it from culture or from the lives of all women. More generally, state-recognized marriage implies treating married couples differently from unmarried couples in stable, permanent, monogamous sexual relationships. It means treating people in sexual relationships differently from those in non-sexual or caring relationships. It means treating those in couples differently from those who are single or polyamorous. It expresses the official view that sexual partnership is both the ultimate goal and the assumed norm. It expresses the assumption that central relationship practices, parenting, cohabitation, financial dependence, migration, care, next of kinship, inheritance, and sex, are bundled together into one dominant relationship. And so, it denies people rights that they need in relation to one practice unless they also engage in all the others and take the extra step of making their relationship status recognized as marriage by the state. This poses the challenge of theoretically identifying and politically asking for fairer alternatives to state-recognized marriage. Looking beyond theoretical objections to state marriage, we can also find plenty of feminist reactions in practice. They include activism for the inclusion of gay people in the institution of marriage, the rejection of marriage, a stance modeled by several prominent figures in the history of feminism, the substitution of state-recognized marriage with contract-based relationships, allowing for various levels of state regulation, and practices such as separatism and political lesbianism, choosing to live apart as far as possible from men, or to renounce sexual activity with them, activity which some have described as collaboration. Although some feminists, in particular black feminists, have criticized compulsory separatism as being indicative of the tendency to take white women's experience as universal. So feminists have opposed, both theoretically and practically, the patriarchal structures that they identified in the traditional private or personal realm of family life. Their critiques cover the legal, economic, sexual, and existential aspects of this realm and what it does to women. Their range of practical political responses is also very diverse. It ranges from militant and genteel campaigning for alterations to the law, to marriage resistance, free love, the establishment of communes run according to feminist principles, to, finally, separatism and political lesbianism.